In the winter of 1879, a young woman inherited an entire town she had never heard of, an abandoned settlement hidden beyond the mountains. The strange part was not that everyone had disappeared. It was that every map, land record, and newspaper reference to the town had been deliberately erased. And when she finally uncovered what the townspeople had buried beneath the old church, she understood why someone had wanted the place forgotten forever. Before we uncover what was buried beneath that forgotten town, like this video, leave a comment telling us what you think she found, and subscribe to the Mountain Tribe for more forgotten mountain stories, mysteries, and legends. The sound came again. 3 slow knocks beneath the church floor. Eleanor stood frozen beside the open trapdoor, staring into the darkness below. Samuel Reed had already extinguished the lantern. He was listening. Neither of them spoke. 3 more knocks. This time, the sound came from somewhere deeper beneath the stone chamber. Eleanor whispered that someone might still be alive. Samuel shook his head. He told her that whatever was down there had been sealed for 18 years. Nothing living could have survived that long without food, water, or air. But Eleanor remembered the final page of the journal. If Eleanor Vale ever comes looking, tell her that her father was the last man who tried to expose them. She looked at the silver locket in her hand. Her name had been engraved on it. Not her father's name, not her mother's, hers. That meant someone had expected her to come. Samuel finally admitted that he knew more than he had told her. In 1861, he had been 28 years old and working as a trapper in the mountains. He had occasionally traded furs in Black Hollow and knew many of the families who lived there. The town had not always been abandoned. At its height, nearly 200 people lived in the valley. Most had come there because of silver. A narrow vein had been discovered beneath the mountain in the late 1840s, and the settlement had grown around it. But Black Hollow had another secret. The richest part of the mine had never appeared on the official claim records. The original settlers had discovered a second underground chamber far beneath the silver workings. Inside were old stone walls, not natural rock formations. Walls. Someone had built them, and they appeared to be much older than the settlement itself. At first, the miners believed they had discovered an abandoned Spanish mine. Then they found something else, a wooden box. Inside were records, names, dates, payment amounts, routes through the mountains, and lists of people who had passed through Black Hollow over many years. The records suggested that the town had been used as a secret meeting point by powerful men from outside the region. They were buying land through false names, moving money through mining companies, and according to the journal, transporting people through the mountains without leaving official records. Eleanor asked who these people were. Samuel said the townspeople never knew all their names. They only knew that some men arrived by night and left before sunrise. They never stayed in the boarding house. They never entered the general store. They went directly to the mine. For years, the townspeople ignored it. They were afraid. Black Hollow was isolated. There was no telegraph office, no railway, no nearby sheriff. The nearest major settlement was several days away by horse. Anyone who complained could simply disappear into the mountains. But in October of 1861, a young schoolteacher named Clara Whitmore discovered the hidden records. She had been helping the town's doctor organize medical supplies when she found a bundle of documents inside an old storage chest. The papers contained names of men who were supposed to be dead. People officially listed as having died in distant towns were recorded as having passed through Black Hollow. Some had been miners, others had been laborers, a few were women, several were children. Clara began asking questions. That was the mistake that changed everything. Within days, people started watching her. Someone broke into her cabin. Her schoolhouse was searched. Then, one night, Clara disappeared. The townspeople found blood on the steps outside her home. They assumed she was dead. But 3 days later, she returned. She would not explain where she had been. She only told the town council that they had to leave Black Hollow immediately. The council refused. They were afraid of losing their homes. They had families. They had businesses. Some believed Clara had simply become frightened. Others suspected she had discovered something far worse. Then, Eleanor's father arrived. His name was Thomas Vale. At the time, he was a young surveyor working in the surrounding mountains. According to Samuel, Thomas had been hired to redraw several property boundaries. Instead, he discovered that entire parcels of land around Black Hollow had been falsified. Land belonging to families who had supposedly sold their property had never actually been sold. Their signatures were forged. The documents had been created years earlier. Thomas began comparing the records. He discovered that the same handwriting appeared on dozens of documents. The land was slowly being transferred to a company called the North Ridge Development Company. North Ridge did not appear to have a real office. Its listed owners were dead men. Its addresses led to empty buildings. Its mining claims were based on surveys that did not match the terrain. Thomas realized that Black Hollow was being erased long before the townspeople understood what was happening. Someone wanted the entire valley, not for the silver, for what was beneath it, the hidden chamber. Thomas returned to Black Hollow in October 1861. That was the night everything changed. According to Samuel, a group of armed men entered the valley shortly after midnight. They came from the northern pass. There were at least 12 of them. They carried lanterns and rifles. The town residents were ordered to remain inside their homes. Anyone who resisted was threatened. The men went directly to the church. The church had been built over the oldest section of the underground passage. The townspeople had never understood why. Thomas did. The church was not built there for worship alone. It had been built to hide the entrance. That night, Thomas and several townspeople tried to stop the men. Clara Whitmore had discovered another part of the secret. She knew the underground chamber contained more than documents. It contained a hidden room, and inside that room were the remains of people who had vanished from the region. Some had been killed. Others appeared to have been imprisoned. The chamber was evidence of years of crimes. If the authorities ever found it, the men responsible would be exposed. So they decided to destroy everything. The townspeople were given one choice: leave. Forget Black Hollow. Never return. Anyone who stayed would be treated as part of the problem. Most families fled that night. They packed what they could carry and disappeared through the southern pass. Others refused. Those people gathered inside the church. Thomas tried to protect them. He failed. According to Samuel, the men sealed the church from outside and set fire to several buildings. But Thomas had discovered a second tunnel beneath the church. He used it to get several people out. Samuel was one of them. They escaped through an old drainage passage that opened into the forest. But not everyone made it out. Some were trapped beneath the church. The men responsible collapsed part of the tunnel. Then they left. By sunrise, Black Hollow was burning. The surviving families scattered. The county was told that a mining accident had destroyed the settlement. The newspapers were given a different story. The official version claimed that most residents had abandoned the town because the mine had failed. Maps were redrawn. Property records disappeared. The name Black Hollow slowly vanished, and the people who knew the truth were warned never to speak about it. Eleanor listened without interrupting. Then she asked the question that had been bothering her since she found her father's journal. If my father escaped, why did he come back? Samuel looked away. Because Thomas had not simply escaped. He had returned. Several times. Every few years he secretly visited Black Hollow. He searched the church. He searched the mine. He searched the valley. He was looking for something. Eleanor asked what? Samuel said Thomas never told him. But there was one thing Thomas repeatedly mentioned: a missing ledger. The original record book containing every name connected to the operation. If that ledger existed, it could prove what had happened. And Thomas believed it had never been destroyed. It had been hidden. Eleanor remembered the iron box. She opened it again. The silver locket was not the only thing inside. There was a folded piece of paper beneath it. She unfolded the paper carefully. It contained a rough drawing of the church. A red mark had been placed beneath the altar. And beneath the drawing were 4 words: "The dead know the way." Eleanor immediately returned to the church. Samuel followed. They moved through the dusty sanctuary and approached the altar. The stone beneath it looked ordinary, but when Eleanor pressed the locket against a small depression in the stone, something clicked. A section of the altar shifted. Behind it was a narrow opening, a hidden staircase. Samuel stared at it. He said Thomas had never told him about that passage. Eleanor took the lantern and descended. The staircase led much deeper than the first chamber. The walls changed from wood-supported mine tunnels to old stone construction. The stones were dark with age. There were markings carved into them. Names. Hundreds of names. Some were dates, some were initials. Others had been crossed out. At the bottom, Eleanor found a wooden door. It was locked, but the brass key from her father's box opened it. Inside was a room no one had entered for 18 years. There were shelves along every wall. On them were hundreds of documents: property deeds, letters, bank records, mining contracts, names of officials, and photographs. Eleanor began searching. Then she found a ledger. The cover was black. The pages were filled with names and payments. Every transaction was carefully recorded. Had funded the operation. The people who transported prisoners. The officials who accepted money. The companies used to conceal the land purchases. Everything was there. Eleanor turned page after page. Then she saw her father's name. Thomas Vale. But beside his name was a date, and underneath it was a sentence that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Thomas Vale knows where the final record is hidden. She stared at the words. Her father had not been merely investigating Black Hollow. Someone had been tracking him. Then she noticed another entry. It was dated only 6 months before her father's death. The handwriting was different. Someone had returned to Black Hollow recently. Someone had opened the hidden room. Someone had searched for the ledger, and they had left one message behind. His daughter will come. Eleanor slowly closed the book. Samuel looked toward the doorway. He had heard something. Footsteps. Not beneath them, above them. Someone was walking inside the church. Eleanor extinguished the lantern. They stood in complete darkness. The footsteps stopped directly above the hidden room. Then came the sound of wood being dragged across the church floor. Someone was searching for the entrance. Eleanor held the ledger against her chest. For 18 years, Black Hollow had been silent. Now someone knew the heir had returned, and whoever had erased the town from the maps had finally realized that Eleanor Vale had discovered the one thing they had failed to destroy: the names, the evidence, and the truth about what had happened beneath the mountain. But Eleanor still had not discovered the most horrifying part. The ledger contained the names of the people who had disappeared, and one of those names belonged to someone Eleanor had always believed had died before she was born: her mother. The letter arrived 3 days after Eleanor Vale buried her father. It was a cold morning in March of 1879, and snow still covered the narrow streets of the remote mountain settlement where Eleanor had spent most of her life. The mountains surrounding the valley were still white at their highest peaks, and the road leading toward the nearest railway remained almost impossible to travel. Eleanor was 27 years old. She had expected her father's estate to be small. There was the family house, a modest collection of furniture, a few pieces of silver, some farmland, and whatever money her father had managed to save during his final years. She had not expected an entire town. The letter came from a solicitor she had never met. Inside was a single legal document informing her that she had inherited ownership of a settlement called Black Hollow, including its abandoned buildings, surrounding acreage, old mining claims, and several parcels of forest. Eleanor read the document twice, then a third time. She had never heard of Black Hollow. When she asked the solicitor where the town was located, his answer made the matter even stranger. He said he did not know. The deed contained coordinates written in an old surveyor's notation, but the solicitor had never personally visited the property. Her father had apparently purchased the land years earlier and had placed it in Eleanor's name through his will. There was one condition. She had to travel to Black Hollow and personally take possession of the property. If she did not, the land would pass into the hands of the county. Eleanor almost refused. The entire thing sounded like an error, but something bothered her. Her father's signature was at the bottom of the document. She knew that handwriting. And beside his signature was a sentence written in his own hand. "Do not sell Black Hollow until you know what lies beneath the church." Eleanor stared at those words for a long time. Her father had never spoken about Black Hollow, not once. She had spent her childhood listening to his stories about mountain trapping, winter expeditions, old mining camps, and the people he had met during his travels. Called Black Hollow. That evening, Eleanor searched through her father's belongings. She found old journals, maps, hunting records, letters, and several weathered notebooks. Nothing mentioned the town. Then, just before midnight, she discovered a small metal box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his study. Inside was a brass key. There was no label. There was also a faded photograph. The picture showed a group of people standing outside a wooden church. The photograph had been taken decades earlier. Eleanor recognized her father immediately. He looked barely 20 years old. Beside him stood several men and women she did not recognize. Behind them was a weathered wooden sign. The words were barely visible. Black Hollow, EST. 1846. Eleanor turned the photograph over. 3 words had been written on the back. They lied about us. That was enough to make her decide. She would go. 2 days later, Eleanor hired a mountain guide named Samuel Reed. Samuel was an older trapper who had spent most of his life traveling through the remote ranges. When Eleanor showed him the coordinates, his expression changed. He knew the place, but he refused to call it Black Hollow. He called it the Empty Valley. When Eleanor asked why, Samuel simply said that people who went there did not usually come back with questions. She thought he was exaggerating. He was not. Their journey took nearly a week. They traveled through narrow mountain passes, frozen streams, thick pine forests, and valleys where no settlement could be seen for miles. There were no proper roads, only old wagon tracks that disappeared beneath snow and fallen trees. On the 5th day, Samuel stopped beside a steep ridge. He pointed toward a distant valley. Eleanor saw smoke. Someone was living there. But as they descended, the smoke disappeared. The valley seemed completely abandoned. Then they saw the first building, a general store. Its windows were broken. Its wooden sign had fallen sideways. Snow covered the porch. Samuel dismounted from his horse. "Black Hollow," he said. Eleanor looked around. The settlement was larger than she expected. There were dozens of buildings scattered along the valley floor. A blacksmith shop, a schoolhouse, a row of small cabins, a boarding house, a stable, a mill, and at the far end of the settlement stood a church, taller than the other buildings. Its bell tower leaned slightly to one side. No smoke came from any chimney. No footprints crossed the snow. No animals moved through the streets. It was as though everyone had simply walked away. Eleanor stepped from her horse. She had inherited a ghost town. But something was wrong. The buildings were not ruined enough to have been abandoned for generations. The doors were still intact. Several chairs remained inside the houses. Cooking pots sat on cold stoves. Children's toys were scattered across the floor of one cabin. A calendar still hung inside the general store. The last marked date was October 14, 1861. Eleanor frowned. That meant the town had been abandoned 18 years earlier. But why, and why had nobody spoken about it? She entered the general store. Dust covered everything. Behind the counter were shelves filled with empty jars. On the wall hung a large town map. Eleanor wiped away the dust. What she saw made her heart stop. Black Hollow was not shown as an abandoned town. The map had been deliberately destroyed. Someone had taken a knife and cut out the entire section showing the valley. Only the surrounding mountains remained. Samuel saw it too. He told Eleanor they should leave before dark. She refused. Her father's warning was still in her mind. Do not sell Black Hollow until you know what lies beneath the church. That night, Eleanor stayed inside the old boarding house. Samuel slept near the entrance with his rifle beside him. The wind howled outside. At around 2 in the morning, Eleanor heard something. A bell. One deep sound. Then silence. A few minutes later, another. Samuel woke immediately. He grabbed his rifle. There hasn't been a bell in that church for 18 years, he whispered. Eleanor looked toward the window. The church tower was visible through the snow. The bell was moving, but there was no wind. Then Eleanor noticed something else. A light. A small yellow glow appeared inside the church. Samuel told her not to go. She went anyway. They crossed the empty street together. The church door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and earth. The pews were covered in dust. The altar was cracked. There were no candles. Yet somewhere beneath the floor came a faint sound, a tapping, 3 knocks, then 3 more. Eleanor followed the sound to the center of the church. She knelt beside the floorboards. One board was newer than the others. She used the brass key from her father's box. It fit into a small iron lock hidden beneath the wood. Eleanor turned the key. A section of the floor opened. Beneath it was a narrow staircase leading into darkness. Samuel raised his lantern. The steps descended far deeper than either of them expected. Eleanor took the first step, then the second. At the bottom was a stone chamber, and inside that chamber stood a wooden table. On the table was a leather-bound journal. Eleanor opened it. The first page carried a date, October 14th, 1861. The exact date shown on the abandoned calendar. Below it was a sentence, "Tonight, Black Hollow disappears." Eleanor turned the page. The next entry explained that the townspeople had discovered something beneath the mountain, something they believed could make them rich. But they soon learned that the thing they had uncovered was not a mine. It was evidence. Evidence that someone had been secretly using Black Hollow for years. And according to the final line on the page, the people responsible had given the townspeople a choice. Leave the valley and forget what you saw, or make sure nobody outside the valley ever learns the truth. Eleanor felt her hands begin to shake. Then she reached the final page. Only one sentence had been written there. If Eleanor Vale ever comes looking, tell her that her father was the last man who tried to expose them. She stopped breathing. Her father had known. He had not inherited Black Hollow by accident. He had been there. And whatever had happened in 1861 had something to do with why the town vanished from every map. But Eleanor had only found the beginning. Because beneath the journal was another object, a small iron box. And inside the box was a child's silver locket. Engraved on its back were 2 words, "For Eleanor." She had never seen it before. Samuel stared at the locket. Then he told her something that changed everything. He said he had known Eleanor's father, and he had been there the night Black Hollow disappeared. Eleanor demanded the truth. Samuel finally looked toward the dark staircase. "There was a mine beneath this church," he said. "But your father didn't come here to find gold." He paused. "He came here to find the people who were buried alive." And somewhere beneath their feet, behind the stone walls of the forgotten chamber, came the sound of another knock. 3 times. Then, silence. Eleanor looked at the floor. The mystery of Black Hollow had just become personal. Her father had not left her a ghost town. He had left her a warning. And whatever had been buried beneath the church 18 years earlier was still waiting to be found. The footsteps above them stopped. Eleanor Vale stood in complete darkness beneath the old church, clutching the black ledger against her chest. Samuel Reed was beside her, holding his breath. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Then something scraped across the floor overhead. A chair. Someone was moving furniture, searching. Eleanor looked toward the wooden door of the hidden room. The only entrance was the staircase they had just descended. If the stranger found it, there would be nowhere to run. Samuel leaned close and whispered that they needed another way out. Eleanor shook her head. She pointed toward the shelves. There had to be another passage. Her father had spent years searching this place. He would never have hidden the ledger in a room without an escape route. They moved silently along the stone wall. The shelves were filled with old records, but several had been disturbed recently. Eleanor noticed a strange gap between two shelves. She pushed against the wood. Nothing happened. Samuel tried. Still nothing. Then Eleanor remembered the words written beneath the drawing. The dead know the way. She looked at the names carved into the stone. One name had been scratched deeper than the others. Martha Vale, her mother's name. Eleanor's mother had supposedly died when Eleanor was 5 years old. Her father had always told her that her mother became sick during a harsh winter and never recovered. There had been no grave she could visit, no funeral she could remember. Only a small wooden box containing her mother's wedding ring. Eleanor had never questioned the story, until now. She touched the carved name. A stone shifted. Was a narrow opening. Samuel stared at her. Eleanor did not speak. They squeezed through the passage. It was barely wide enough for a person. The air was cold and damp. The passage sloped downward before turning beneath the mountain. Behind them, they heard a heavy thud. The stranger had found the hidden staircase. Eleanor moved faster. The tunnel eventually opened into another chamber. There was a small table in the center. On it rested an oil lamp. The lamp had recently been used. Someone had been here, recently. Beside the lamp was a collection of letters. Eleanor recognized the handwriting immediately. Her father's. She opened the first letter. It was dated 18 years earlier. Thomas Vale had written that he had discovered evidence that Black Hollow had been used as a secret holding point for people who were being transported through the mountains. But there was more. The people involved were not simply criminals. Some were wealthy landowners, some were businessmen, some were local officials. The operation had been protected because too many powerful people profited from it. Thomas had tried to expose them. He had gathered evidence. He had spoken to a federal investigator, and then the investigator disappeared. Thomas realized that the people behind Black Hollow were not afraid of the law. They controlled enough of it to make witnesses disappear. Eleanor opened another letter. This one was addressed to her, but it had never been sent. My dear Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I have failed to keep Black Hollow buried. She stopped. The letter explained why her father had never told her about the town. He had been trying to protect her. Her mother Martha had discovered the hidden records before him. She had not died from illness. She had disappeared. Thomas had spent years searching for her. He eventually discovered that Martha had been taken to Black Hollow after finding evidence connecting several wealthy men to the underground operation. Thomas believed she had been killed, but he had never found her body. Then years later, he found her name in the ledger. Not among the dead, among the living. Eleanor's hands began to tremble. She read the line again. Martha Vale, transferred north, October 1861. Her mother had been alive after the night Black Hollow disappeared. Eleanor felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted. Everything her father had told her was a lie, or perhaps it had been the lie he needed her to believe. Samuel looked at her. He admitted that Thomas had once asked him to help search for Martha. Samuel had never told Eleanor because Thomas made him promise. Eleanor asked if Samuel knew what happened to her. He said no. But Thomas had eventually discovered a clue. Martha had been moved through a mountain route leading north. There was an old logging settlement beyond the ridge, a place that no longer existed. Thomas believed she had been taken there. Then the trail disappeared. Eleanor opened another letter. This one contained a map. It showed the mountain range surrounding Black Hollow. A red line crossed the northern ridge. At the end was a small mark. Station 9. Samuel recognized it. There had once been a private railway loading station there. It had been abandoned decades ago. Eleanor asked why a railway station would matter. Samuel said it had never been an ordinary station. The North Ridge Company had used it to transport supplies without official records. The station had been built away from the main railway line. Freight wagons could reach it through a private mountain track. No public schedules mentioned it. No maps showed it. The same people who erased Black Hollow had built a hidden transportation route through the mountains. Eleanor realized the town had been part of something much larger. Black Hollow was not the center of the operation. It was only one piece. She turned back to the ledger. The entries stretched across decades. Names, payments, dates, locations. Then she saw something that made her heart race. Several pages had been torn out. Someone had removed the final section. Samuel pointed to the binding. The missing pages had been removed recently. Not 18 years ago. Recently. Someone had returned to this room and taken the most important evidence. Eleanor searched the floor. Behind the table she found a small metal clasp. It belonged to an envelope. The envelope was hidden beneath a loose stone. Inside was a photograph. The image showed a group of people standing beside a wooden building. Eleanor recognized her father. Beside him stood a woman. The photograph was old, but Eleanor knew the woman's face. She had seen it in a photograph from her childhood. Her mother, Martha Vale, alive. Eleanor stared at the picture. On the back was a date, October 1871, 10 years after Black Hollow supposedly vanished. Her mother had been alive, and she had been standing beside Thomas. But why had her father never told her? Eleanor turned the photograph over again. There was a second sentence, "Were taken." Eleanor felt sick. Children. The ledger had listed missing people. Among them were children. She had assumed they were victims. Now she realized there might have been survivors. People who had been transported elsewhere. People whose identities had been erased. And perhaps her mother had spent years searching for them. Suddenly, footsteps echoed through the tunnel. The stranger had found the passage. Samuel blew out the lamp. They moved toward the far end of the chamber. There was another doorway. They entered. The room beyond was smaller. It contained wooden crates. Most were empty. One was not. Eleanor opened it. Inside were dozens of personal belongings. Wedding rings, pocket watches, children's shoes, letters, photographs, small toys. Each item had a number attached to it. Samuel stared at the objects. He recognized some of the names. Families who had disappeared from Black Hollow. Eleanor realized what the room was. It was an archive of the people who had vanished. Someone had kept their belongings, perhaps as records, perhaps as trophies. Then she found something else, a small red ribbon. She knew it immediately. It had belonged to her mother. Eleanor had seen it in an old photograph from her childhood. She held it tightly. Then a voice came from the tunnel. "Eleanor." She froze. The voice was male, old, calm, and familiar. Samuel raised his rifle. The voice came again. "Opened the ledger." Eleanor whispered that she recognized the voice. It belonged to Edmund Crane, her father's oldest friend, the man who had attended her father's funeral, the man who had helped Eleanor arrange the estate, the man who had given her the solicitor's contact information, the man who had told her that Black Hollow was probably nothing more than an old mining settlement. He had known, all along. Edmund stepped into the doorway carrying a lantern. He was not alone. Two armed men stood behind him. Eleanor demanded to know what happened to their mother. Edmund did not answer. Instead, he said something that terrified her more. "Your father found her." Eleanor asked where. Edmund smiled faintly. "Right here." He pointed toward the stone wall. Then he told Eleanor the truth. Martha had not been taken north. She had escaped. She had returned to Black Hollow with Thomas years later. Together they had found the final evidence. But Martha had made one mistake. She trusted someone. That person had betrayed her. Thomas had spent the rest of his life trying to protect Eleanor from the same people. Edmund stepped closer. He said the ledger was incomplete. The names inside it were only half the story. The missing pages contained the names of the men who had ordered everything. And those names were still powerful. Some of their descendants now owned banks, mines, rail companies, and newspapers. They had spent decades making sure Black Hollow remained forgotten. Eleanor asked why Edmund had allowed her to inherit the town. His answer was simple: "Because your father never told us where he hid the final evidence." Eleanor realized the inheritance had been a trap. They had not been waiting for her to inherit Black Hollow. They had been waiting for her to lead them to what her father had hidden. But Edmund had made one mistake. He had assumed Eleanor was alone. She wasn't. Samuel stepped from the darkness behind him. His rifle was raised. The two armed men turned. A gunshot exploded through the underground chamber. The lantern shattered. Darkness swallowed everything. Eleanor ran. She grabbed the photograph, the ledger, and her mother's red ribbon. Behind her, men shouted. Samuel fired again. The tunnel filled with smoke. Eleanor followed the narrow passage until she saw moonlight. She emerged through an opening on the mountainside. Snow covered the ground. She dropped to her knees. For the first time in her life, she understood that her entire childhood had been built around a secret. Her mother had not died. Her father had not been paranoid. Black Hollow had not been abandoned because of a failed mine. And the people who erased the town were still alive. But Eleanor had only escaped with part of the truth. The most important pages of the ledger were still missing. And according to her father's final letter, those pages contained the location of the original burial chamber, the place where the victims of Black Hollow had been hidden. Eleanor looked back toward the church. Smoke was rising from its windows. Edmund and his men had set the building on fire. They were destroying the evidence. But Eleanor noticed something strange. The smoke was not coming from the church alone. It was rising from beneath the mountain. The ground began to tremble. Samuel emerged from the tunnel moments later. He told Eleanor they had to leave. She refused. The fire had exposed a crack in the rock. Behind it was a stone passage, a passage that had been sealed for 18 years. Eleanor realized what it meant. The burial chamber had never been beneath the church. The church had only been the entrance. The real chamber was deeper, far beneath the mountain, and whatever her father had spent his final years searching for was waiting there. Eleanor picked up the lantern. She looked at Samuel. Then she stepped toward the opening. She had come to Black Hollow believing she had inherited a ghost town. Now she understood the truth. She had inherited a crime scene, and buried somewhere beneath that mountain was the evidence that could finally explain why an entire town had been erased from history. But before Eleanor could descend, she noticed one final detail carved into the stone. A date. 1879, the year she had arrived. Someone had carved it recently, which meant whoever had been waiting for her had known the exact year she would come. And suddenly, Eleanor understood something even more frightening. Her inheritance had not begun with her father's death. It had been planned long before she was born. Outline 4. What was buried beneath Black Hollow? The mountain trembled beneath Eleanor Vale's feet. Behind her, the old church burned. Smoke poured from its broken windows and drifted across the valley, turning the snow gray beneath the moonlight. Samuel Reed stood beside her, with his rifle in hand. Ahead of them was the newly exposed passage in the mountainside. For 18 years, that entrance had been sealed. Now the stone had cracked open. Eleanor looked at the date carved above it, 1879. Someone had marked the passage in the same year she inherited Black Hollow. She asked Samuel who could have done it. He had no answer. Then Eleanor noticed something else. The carving was fresh. The stone around the numbers was still pale where the surface had recently been cut. Someone had prepared the entrance for her. Someone knew she would come. She tightened her grip around the black ledger. There was no turning back. She entered the tunnel. The passage descended beneath the mountain at a steep angle. The walls were different from the old mining tunnels. They were made from enormous blocks of stone, fitted together without mortar. This was not the work of 19th century miners. Whatever had been built beneath Black Hollow was much older. Samuel held the lantern high. Along the walls were carvings, names, dates, symbols, and occasionally small handprints pressed into the stone. Eleanor stopped at one. It was the handprint of a child. Beneath it was a name, Joseph Bell. The name appeared in the ledger. He had been 8 years old when he disappeared. Eleanor realized what the chamber had been used for. The people who vanished from Black Hollow were marked here. Black Hollow had been brought here. But the evidence suggested something unexpected. Not all of them had been killed. Some had survived. There were marks on the walls showing groups of people had been held there. Food storage areas, water containers, sleeping spaces. Someone had imprisoned them. But for what purpose? The tunnel continued deeper. After several minutes, they reached a massive stone door. There was no handle, only a circular indentation in the center. Eleanor examined the brass key her father had left her. It did not fit. Then she remembered the silver locket. She pressed it against the indentation. A mechanism clicked. The stone door slowly moved inward. Beyond it was a chamber larger than the church above. The ceiling disappeared into darkness. Hundreds of wooden boxes were stacked against the walls. Eleanor opened the nearest one. Inside were documents. She pulled out a bundle, land deeds, hundreds of them. Every document represented a property that had been transferred through false names. She opened another box, bank records, mining contracts, payment ledgers. Then another, photographs, letters, newspaper clippings. Black Hollow had been the hidden archive for a criminal network that had operated across the mountains for decades. But the documents revealed something more disturbing. The operation was not simply about stealing land. The people behind it had discovered that the remote mountains were ideal for hiding people. Workers who could not legally be forced to labor were brought through secret routes. Some were immigrants, some were debtors, some were people whose families had disappeared. They were used in illegal mining operations far from any authority. When someone died, their identity could be erased. When someone escaped, their name could be changed. Black Hollow was a place where people could disappear without anyone asking questions. The silver mine had been a cover. The real wealth came from the people being exploited. Eleanor felt sick. She asked Samuel how nobody had stopped it. He said the mountains protected the secret. The men behind the operation paid officials. They controlled property records. They bribed newspapers. They threatened witnesses. And when Black Hollow became dangerous, they simply erased it. But the chamber contained something the criminals had failed to destroy. A complete record. Names, dates, payments, orders, everything. Eleanor continued searching. Then she found a small wooden chest. Her father's initials were carved into the lid. TV. She opened it. Inside was a letter. It was the final letter Thomas Vale had ever written. The date was only weeks before his death. Eleanor began reading. Her father explained everything. He had discovered Black Hollow when he was a young surveyor. He had fallen in love with Martha, who was already helping the townspeople uncover the truth. Together they gathered evidence. They planned to expose the operation, but someone betrayed them. Martha disappeared. Thomas believed she had been killed. Years later he discovered that she had survived. She had been hiding under another name. Thomas eventually found her. They reunited in secret, and together they returned to Black Hollow. They found the underground archive. They found evidence that could destroy the men responsible. But they also discovered something else. The criminal network had been larger than they imagined. The men who operated Black Hollow were connected to powerful businessmen in several distant cities. Thomas knew that releasing the evidence without protection would get them killed. So he created a plan. He divided the evidence into 3 parts. The first part was the Black Ledger. The second part was hidden beneath the church. The third part was given to someone he trusted. That person was Martha. Eleanor stopped reading. Her mother was still alive. Thomas had spent years pretending otherwise, because he believed Eleanor would be safer if she never knew. The final letter explained that Martha had gone into hiding again. She carried the last evidence. Thomas wrote that he could not tell Eleanor where Martha was. Someone was watching him. But he left one clue. If the mountain ever calls you back, look for the woman who wears the red ribbon. Eleanor looked down. The red ribbon she had found earlier was still in her hand. She asked Samuel if he knew what it meant. Before he could answer, a voice came from the far end of the chamber. Yes. Eleanor turned. A woman stood in the darkness. She was older. Her hair was streaked with gray. She wore a heavy mountain coat, and tied around her wrist was a faded red ribbon. Eleanor couldn't move. The woman stepped into the lantern light. It was Martha, her mother, alive. For several seconds, Eleanor could not speak. She had imagined her mother's face thousands of times, but never like this. Martha looked at her daughter with tears in her eyes. Then she whispered Eleanor's name. Eleanor dropped the ledger. She crossed the chamber. Mother and daughter embraced. For the first time in 22 years. Eleanor was held by the woman she believed was dead. Martha explained that she had been hiding in the mountains for years. She had changed her name, moved between remote settlements, avoided towns, never stayed anywhere long. She had watched Eleanor from a distance when she could, but she could never reveal herself. The people behind Black Hollow were still searching for the missing evidence. If they knew Martha was alive, they would come after Eleanor. That was why Thomas had kept the truth hidden. Eleanor asked why Martha had allowed her to inherit Black Hollow. Martha shook her head. I didn't. Eleanor froze. Martha explained that Thomas had deliberately arranged the inheritance. He knew he was dying. He also knew the people who had destroyed Black Hollow would eventually search his estate. He needed someone they would underestimate, someone they would not expect to return. His daughter. Eleanor realized the inheritance had been her father's final move. He had not left her a burden. He had left her the key to exposing everything. But Martha warned her that they had very little time. Edmund Crane knew they had found the chamber. He would return, and he would not come alone. They gathered the documents. Samuel found a second passage leading out of the mountain. Before leaving, Eleanor looked back at the chamber. Hundreds of boxes, hundreds of names, generations of secrets. Then she saw something carved into the stone near the exit. A list of names. At the bottom was one she recognized. Edmund Crane. Martha explained that Edmund had not merely been Thomas's friend. He had been one of the original men who helped build the network. He had betrayed Thomas and Martha in 1861. He had helped erase Black Hollow. He had remained close to the Vale family for one reason. He wanted to know where the final evidence was hidden. Eleanor realized why Edmund had been at her father's funeral. He had been waiting. He knew Thomas was dead. He expected the secret to die with him. But Thomas had already chosen Eleanor. The 3 of them escaped through the mountain passage shortly before dawn. They emerged several miles from Black Hollow. Behind them, the old church collapsed into flames. The bell tower fell. The valley filled with smoke. By sunrise, the building that had hidden the entrance for 18 years was gone. But the evidence had survived. Eleanor, Martha, and Samuel traveled for weeks. They carried the documents in sealed boxes. Eventually they reached a distant town where a federal investigator was willing to examine the evidence. The documents were authenticated. Names were cross-checked. Property records were compared. Financial transactions were traced. The investigation expanded. People who had believed themselves untouchable suddenly found themselves questioned. Several powerful men fled. Others were arrested. Some died before they could face trial. The full truth about Black Hollow finally began to emerge. Newspapers that had once ignored the settlement published accounts of the missing families. Survivors came forward. Children who had been taken from their homes were identified. Families learned what had happened to relatives they had spent years believing were dead. But Eleanor never returned to Black Hollow. The valley remained isolated. The old buildings were eventually reclaimed by the forest. Snow covered the foundations. Trees grew through the abandoned streets. The church became nothing more than a pile of blackened timber. Yet Eleanor kept one thing from the town. The brass key also kept her mother's red ribbon. Years later, she wrote down the entire story. Not because she wanted fame, not because she wanted revenge. She wrote because she understood what her father had feared. A place can disappear from a map. A name can be removed from a record. A newspaper can refuse to print the truth. But people remember. And sometimes the smallest surviving piece of evidence is enough to bring an entire buried story back into the light. Eleanor eventually learned why her father had written those words in his will. Do not sell Black Hollow until you know what lies beneath the church. He had known that gold was not buried beneath the town. Something far more valuable was the truth. And the final mystery was solved years later when investigators discovered that the town had never truly been erased by accident. The mapmakers had been paid. The land records had been altered. The newspaper reports had been suppressed. Black Hollow had been deliberately removed from history because powerful men believed they could erase the people who had witnessed their crimes. They were wrong. Eleanor had inherited the place they wanted forgotten. She had walked through its empty streets. She had opened the church. She had found the buried records. And beneath the mountain, she had found the names of hundreds of people who had been denied the right to be remembered. The ghost town was never haunted. Not by ghosts, by memories. And when Eleanor finally understood what her father had left her, she realized the greatest treasure buried beneath Black Hollow had never been silver, money, or land. It was the proof that the dead had not been forgotten. Their names were still there. Their stories were still there, waiting beneath the mountain for someone brave enough to find them. And that was why Black Hollow had been wiped from every map. Nothing there. But because there was too much truth.